Hi, Katrin. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you for inviting me to this podcast.
You're most welcome. You've got a very interesting background. Do you want to just start off with, like, for the listeners, give them a quick brief on how you started, why you started, and what got you into it?
Yeah, so I studied psychology at the University of Constance in Germany. And after that, or during that time, I got really interested in neuroscience and brain research, especially, how all the chemicals in our brain kind of make us feel what we feel, make us think what we think. And so I then took this a little bit further and did a PhD focusing on substance abuse. So what changes in the brain of people who basically change their system by taking drugs. And I thought that was super interesting, and it's a really important research to help develop new therapeutics for drug addiction. However, I also felt like it's not really satisfying my curiosity when it comes to understanding neuropharmacology, understanding what the chemicals in our brains do. And that led me to move on to a postdoc in the field of psychedelics. And psychedelics really give us this window in the brain because we can, for a certain amount of time, basically challenge our system, stimulate very specific receptors, and elicit these incredible responses like changes in the way you perceive yourself, etc., that are otherwise really, really hard to study. So that was incredibly interesting, and I still really like this mechanistic part of psychedelic research. But what we also then, taking the next step, investigated is that these substances may also have beneficial effects for patients. So we then moved on to more clinical trials looking at the therapeutic effects of these drugs, but always coming back also to this mechanistic point of view, trying to understand why exactly these substances help people.
I want to go back a bit. You said what the mechanism and then how we feel when we use or like, take these drugs. What is it about human nature that wants to keep doing it? Because okay, this is not your status quo. Like a lot of like traditional religion says, like I'm originally Muslim, and they said don't use substances that can change the way your perception is of the world around you. That's not the case with every religion, but there's not that much like embracing of use of psychedelics or drugs. But we as humans keep going back and seeking it almost for enlightenment, sometimes just exploration, curiosity. Is it a mix of all of this, or is it just again something that's evolutionarily something that we just need to do?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think I want to start with making a bit of a differentiation between different classes of drugs. So when we are talking about drugs like alcohol, like heroin, like cocaine, right? So these drugs are addictive. So we may seek it for, certain purposes like stress relief, like calming down, like, getting high. That feeling may eventually turn into an addiction. So we're basically, our body is and our mind are forcing us to continue using these substances. With psychedelics, the thing is a bit different because those drugs are non-addictive. We know that from animal studies. We also know that from human studies. So it will be very hard to find people who use these substances on a daily basis. And that already makes a huge difference. So with psychedelics, the reason why people are using psychedelics are definitely there are many reasons, and I don't really know if it's evolutionary. They have been used for a long time, that is for sure. So there seems to be something in this experience which is at least interesting for people, and that may be experiencing something different. It may be curiosity, It may be, self-exploration. It may be developing, this different view of the world. For some people, it may also just be, a pleasant experience. But this is also something that differentiates psychedelics from other drugs, because usually the trip is not just, euphoric and pleasant. It's more of a roller coaster, really, where, you have phases which may be very blissful, very calm, but you can also experience a lot of, emotional uproar, which may or may not be particularly pleasant. And especially with high doses and in uncontrolled environments, it may also get, pretty terrible. So, it's really a mixed bag with psychedelics when it comes to the effects, the subjective effects of these drugs. So yeah, so basically there is no one answer why people are using these drugs, really. I think there are probably as many answers out there as there are humans who use them.
You briefly mentioned, some big part of your work is about how people think and why they feel the way they feel or how they feel. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, so of course we have a lot of chemicals in our brain, right? So that is really, the transmission between different synapses in the brain is really what eventually leads to perception. It leads to memory, it leads to emotions, etc. And this transmission between the synapses is regulated via neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters basically work as a key and lock system. So certain neurotransmitters can open certain receptors and then change the way information is processed in the brain. And if you change the keys, then you will open different locks. And that is exactly what we're doing when we're changing the brain chemistry of the brain. And certain, keys and locks do different things than others. And we still have very little understanding of what exactly is happening in the brain there, because it's an organ that we cannot just open up and look in it and try to figure out and stick electrodes in there. So living humans usually don't like that if you do that. So it is really, it's a very complicated organ, and it's really hard to assess it from the outside. So we need to find ways around that to with neuroimaging techniques, etc., to get closer to this. But also one tool that we have is acutely changing the neurochemistry of the brain. And that is usually what we do with pharmacological challenges, meaning we are administering drugs to people. And of course, when we're administering drugs to healthy people, we want to make sure that they are safe. So we can't give them addictive substances. We only can give people substances that we consider safe for research, so we don't expose our participants to any risks. And in the right environment, and I'm talking about this medical research environment here, psychedelics are those substances. So with in the right environment, in this research setting, so a very controlled setting, we can administer these substances. We know that they target predominantly the serotonin 2A receptor, which means that we can find out more about the role of the serotonin 2A receptor in the human brain.
And what are some of the insights that you found? Like, what is the mechanistic psychedelic research state like right now?
Yeah, so we first of all, there are different lines of research, really. So one line is, what are these drugs doing in the brain in general? So without necessarily looking at a specific cognitive function or emotion, etc. So first of all, we're trying to figure out, what changes in the brain if you are under the influence of a psychedelic and you're experiencing the psychedelic state. And what we've found there so far is that there are certain areas in the brain. So one area specifically, which is called the thalamus. So that is a core structure pretty much in the middle of our brain. And what the thalamus usually does is it's filtering information from the environment, so what we see, what we feel, if there is any touch, etc., but also information that's coming from within our body. And what usually happens is that the thalamus is filtering information, it's classifying it into important information, not so important information, and only the important information will get processed onto the cortex. And the cortex is basically more or less much of the rest of the brain. And this cortex is then responsible for integrating all this information and making a coherent picture. So basically the reality as we're experiencing it on an everyday basis. So we see a room, we see the specific details, everything is pretty much in order. We connect what we see to our future planning, we connect it to our memories, etc. Now with psychedelics, this filtering process doesn't work like it usually does. So which then leads to a different kind of information being processed in the cortex. And of course, we don't only look at the thalamus, not only at this filtering mechanism, but we also want to see what's happening then in the rest of the brain. So once the information is in the brain, what happens after that? And what we've seen there is that especially the areas which are responsible for our sensory processing, so what we see, what we feel, what we hear, etc. So these areas are highly connected with each other, meaning that we have a heightened sensory state, which is probably something that everyone who has ever taken a psychedelic might have also experienced, because it is a very sensory state. But on the other hand, we also see that the areas which are responsible for integrating this information, for making sense of it, for providing this coherent picture that is aligned with our memory and our future planning, that these brain areas are loosely connected to each other, meaning that the way we bring all this information together seems to be different under the influence of a psychedelic. Which also means that this could provide us with this new, perception of the world, the perception of what happened, of ourselves and our role in the world, which may also be something that actually could be therapeutic for people who are, stuck in specific thinking patterns, like in depression, for example, where people ruminate and have this, terrible negative image of themselves, right? So that is one line of research. Another line of research is, investigating very specific functions. And here, for example, we've seen that emotion processing is different under psychedelics. So we process positive emotions more strongly than negative emotions under the influence of a psychedelic. We also investigated social functioning, for example, and there we've seen that that people under the influence of a psychedelic act or perceive social stimuli as more positive. So there are acute pro-social activities. And again, all of that tells us that the serotonin 2A receptor specifically is involved in these processes. And if we have a patient group, for example, which suffers from alterations or deficits in that area, and that is the case in many psychiatric indications, then the serotonin 2A receptor may be a good target to change that, to make people feel better about these things.
I might be going off on a complete tangent, but it's something that I feel like there might be some connection. Is there some research that has gone in tandem with understanding the pathways that, like the pathways with dreams when we go to sleep versus psychedelics? Because I feel there are very similar, ways of like the way it's like like you mentioned, like us processing things that have happened, us understanding, like putting them in places. uh Dreams in a way do the same thing, and again, dreams are super vivid. Sometimes you don't even understand them, but then they try to connect you to your conscious subconscious mind. Is this something, again, I might be reaching, but like, your thoughts?
Yeah, super interesting question. So what we have done is we analyze basically the reports of people. And again, here we're only talking about subjective experience, not necessarily about brain patterns. And we indeed saw that the psychedelic state, when people reported, has some similarities to what people report when they're dreaming. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any study that actually um, looked at what is happening in the brain when people are dreaming and compared that directly to the psychedelic state. We have done a study like this. We compared the psilocybin-induced state, LSD-induced state with meditation and with hypnosis. And there we unfortunately didn't see a lot of similarities, even though people report similar experiences in these states. So what we saw here is that LSD and psilocybin were pretty similar when we're looking at the general effects on the brain. That's not necessarily surprising, but what was surprising is that what we saw when we looked at people who are acutely meditating or who are under the acute influence of hypnosis, that was very, very different from a psychedelic induced
Mm.
state. So it would, of course, be really interesting to basically repeat that with someone or with a group of people who are acutely dreaming. However, that's one of the reasons why sleep research and dream research is a bit harder, because we cannot just push a button or give people a substance and then all of a sudden they are actually dreaming, right? It's a very complicated and laborious research because yeah, you basically need to have people sleeping for a while, and then you need to wait until they actually start dreaming. And people don't usually sleep super well in an MR scanner, so
Mm.
that makes things a little bit complicated, but that doesn't mean that that this cannot be done. And it would be incredibly interesting to have this direct comparison between what's happening in the brain under a psychedelic versus dreaming.
Could you share some insights into the significance of understanding social cognition in both healthy individuals and those with psychiatric illnesses?
Yeah. So social cognition is one of the domains that we see is impaired more or less across the psychiatric spectrum. So, and the reason why I think this is really important is because social cognition is such an important aspect of our everyday life, right? So we need it for pretty much everything. We need it when we want to rent an apartment. We needed to be successful in a job, right? We needed to be happy in our everyday lives to be able to interact with other people. So it's really terribly important. Now, having impairments in this domain um, often leads to social withdrawal, and that is something that we see in psychiatric patients a lot. Um, and that again has an impact on, well, the development of psychiatric disorders. I mean, we've seen, and we just went through the pandemic, right? So we've seen the effects of social isolation, and they're definitely not good for your mental health. But also, if you already have developed a psychiatric problem, social withdrawal means you get less support. It may also mean that it's harder to connect with your therapist, with your doctors, which is also not helpful for getting better. And therefore, this is really a domain which, where we need improvement, because it's just so important for the therapeutic process and for everyday life. Um, And that's why we were and still are very interested in, understanding these social parts and the social components also of the psychedelic experience. And we did a lot of studies in healthy participants with LSD as well as with psilocybin, and there we saw that healthy participants under the acute influence are well, more pro-social. They don't react as strongly to social rejection, which again is relevant for depression, for example. We already talked about this negative bias in depressed patients. So here, just an example, when I walk down the street and I see, a friend of mine who doesn't greet me, I would probably assume that, they just didn't see me. However, a depressed person may walk down the street, see this friend, the friend doesn't greet, and they were like, oh my God, they don't like me anymore. What did I do wrong? Right. So, and that's, of course, also not helpful for moving forward because it just reinforces this negative bias. And that's why, for example, we looked at the response to social rejection, because we know that this response is increased in, for example, depression. And here we saw that at least acutely, psychedelics reduce this response to social rejection. So it's people are aware that they are excluded from a game in our case, but just the emotional response to that isn't that strongly. Again, giving us a hint that in psychiatric populations, like in depressed individuals, for example, this may help them to, normalize this increased reaction. So these are all studies that we've done acutely in healthy participants to understand the system, to understand which aspects of a psychedelic experience may be helpful for people. But of course, when we're using these drugs in a therapeutic setting, we don't just want them to have a pro-social time while they are tripping, right? We need these pro-social effects to last beyond the experience, because otherwise people just go home and it's back to the way they were before. And that is something that we still haven't figured out really. Are these pro-social effects actually lasting? And that is, that's necessary for it to be helpful. And that's a study that we're doing right now, where we are comparing the pro-social effects of psilocybin versus MDMA versus Ritalin, so an amphetamine as a control condition. And we're looking at whether these pro-social effects that we observe acutely actually last beyond the acute experience, and then giving us another hint of why these drugs could be helpful in clinical populations.
Your research delves into substances use disorders and the role of serotonin systems in emotion and cognition. What sparked your interest in these areas, and what do you believe are the most pressing questions in this field?
Yeah. So when it comes to substance use disorders, I think we definitely need new treatment approaches here. Um, we don't have a lot of really medication to help these people. We know that if they undergo withdrawal, a lot of them relapse pretty much right away. So it's really a huge unmet need. So we definitely need to get better in this area. And we knew that with psychedelics, um, alcohol addiction was one of the first indications that LSD was tested for back in the 50s and 60s. And it actually showed pretty promising results. So that's why I think testing psychedelics for substance use disorders has a really great potential in an area of really unmet need. That said, of course, so far we only have a few studies. The results are somewhat inconclusive at that point, so we really need to figure out, is there something that is helpful in psychedelics for this specific patient population.
And what are the key challenges in realizing their potential? Like I know you said that they were inclusive. So what is holding us back? Not just you, but as a community of researchers who are interested in this field and looking for like the solution. Because if there is a potential for LSD, and I believe psilocybin as well for addiction disorders, and I mean the writings on the wall, this might help us. And there's such a huge problem with addiction. Why aren't we just connecting the dots?
Yeah, so I mean, drug development is complicated. So the issue is that with especially with these initial very small studies, usually they overestimate the effect because these are basically hand-selected patients that are included in these trials. So we need larger trials to have a better idea of how that would work in real life. And these larger trials are still missing. And the reason for that is, well, first of all, they are expensive, so we need to get funding for those type of trials. That has been a huge problem in the past. It's starting to get a bit better now. But of course, it's also, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of bureaucratic work to get these types of studies approved. And of course, it takes a lot of patients who are interested in, trying this new treatment and undergoing a study like this. And that is just something that I'm sure we will get there. But it's something, if we want to do it right, and I think we really need to do it right, then it's just something that takes time and money and effort.
Um, Leading to that, I have a question related to the fact that you said, okay, this is it's going to take time. There is a lot of like, red tape, funding, and all of that. Would there ever be, like, we all know, like at the end of the day, like there's a lot of use of psychedelics in the public space. Given legalization, when that is lifted, and it is lifting over like across the US at least, and a lot of like other parts of the world, and if that opens up, would that kind of almost be like, I am not technically within a study, but I can give you data on my insights, and then that can like kind of distill down to, again, working information that can be used to, again, study it?
Yeah. So I think there are different efforts going on in the US to do exactly that, to collect data from people who are using psychedelics legally in states where the use of psychedelics is at least decriminalized. Um, and I think this is really important information because it gives us, an impression of how these drugs are used in the real world and the effects in terms of, risks as well as benefits in people who are more or less allowed to use the drugs. That said, I don't think that this type of research can replace controlled trials because we always we have less information. It's an uncontrolled setting. Sometimes people don't know the dose they have been taken. There are a couple of a lot of other influencing factors that we just don't really know about, right? And usually it's also difficult to share a lot of health related information because those are very personal data. So I think this type of research cannot replace the randomized controls trials. We also need these control conditions because sometimes people just get better on their own. We don't know whether that had anything to do with the substance administration. So that's why we need these control conditions, etc. But what we definitely can take from this type of research is to basically find the needle in the haystack, right? Sometimes it's really hard to find out where exactly we need to look. And I think this type of research can give us hints to figure out where it's worthwhile investing, money, time, effort, run a controlled clinical trial. because we do have these first hints from these more observational studies that you just mentioned.
What about the ethical considerations? We're talking about regulatory, challenges, but from a person who is working in this in field and researching it, what are the things that you need to consider and what you feel like your peers should consider when working with psychedelics?
Yeah. So I think what the first thing that we all need to make sure is that our participants are safe. That needs to be the major goal. Um, and of course, there are guidelines, there are ethics committees, there are the whole regulatory bodies that you mentioned that needs to approve the study. Um, and I think we need to work within these guidelines, but I think even on top of that, we need to make sure we have a responsibility to keep, our participants safe. And what that means is, well, first of all, we need to check their medical history. We need to make sure that there are no other underlying conditions that could interact with the administration of the psychedelic, and that is, for example, heart diseases, cardiovascular problems. That is also a history of schizophrenia, for example. We don't include anyone who has a history of schizophrenia. And then, of course, as we move forward, once we have included our participant, we need to make sure that they can build a trusting relationship with the study personnel. So that is really important, especially if you give someone a substance that is so psychoactive like psychedelics. There needs to be some trust, and you need to have people who are there during the experience, who are trained and who know how to empathically supervise an experience like that. And after the experience, also making sure that people have someone in the study team they can talk about about this experience. And that is, of course, that all of that holds true when we're doing studies with healthy participants. With patients, we go even further. We do embed this experience in a psychotherapeutic setting, meaning we have multiple preparation sessions, we have multiple integration sessions after the experience, to make sure that people can process what they have experienced, and make sure that there is a level of transfer into their everyday life, to hopefully make them better. And I think that these aspects are really important, because we don't want to mess with people. We need to make this a safe environment and a safe intervention.
Can you discuss some of the methodological advancements or innovations in neuroimaging and neuropharmacology that you find particularly promising for future research in this field?
Yeah. So one thing that we have started working on is more on the analytical side than on the technological side, is to starting to get away a little bit from group comparisons. So basically looking at one group of people, they have received psilocybin, one group of people, they have received placebo, because we know that every brain is slightly different, and we're now starting to investigate whether we can quantify this variance between people, and how this relates to the effects of psychedelics, but also how this relates to response to therapy, because we've seen now in these larger clinical trials that are starting to get published right now with psychedelics, that unfortunately not everyone is responding, right? We have some people who really do better, but we also see that there are people in these trials who may only get better for a day or so, and then they relapse. And of course, that is something, that holds true for every therapeutic intervention. But we don't understand that. Like, why does it work for one person and why does it not work for the other? And starting to quantify this heterogeneity may help us understanding that, and eventually also developing more targeted interventions. And I think that's an active field of research, not only in psychedelics, but really in general when it comes to brain imaging. We don't know where this is going to lead us, but I think it is really promising, and it is the right approach to actually, think more specifically about the individual and not just about, the average of a group of individuals.
What role do you think interdisciplinary collaborations plays in advancing the understanding the neuropharmacology of emotions and then cognitive process? Like you're talking about psychology and then psychedelics, but then there are a lot of people who work in their silos in their own field and then they don't expand beyond. Sometimes that can become a good thing because you've got like a one-track mind, you progress. But I feel like there could be a possibility of that kind of hindering your research or like looking beyond what you're like, you've kind of zoned in on.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that in psychedelic research, I think that has always been a pretty heterogeneous field, right? Because psychedelics are interesting from so many angles, it basically forces us to work together with other disciplines. And just, if I'm looking at my work in my lab, what we do is we there are, of course, psychologists, but of course, there are also pharmacologists because, it's a pharmacological intervention. There are medical doctors because it is a medical intervention. And beyond that, we work with physicists because we're doing brain scans. We work with computer scientists because the analytical methods are getting more and more complicated. Yesterday, I just talked to a philosopher. There are a lot of studies going on also with religious professionals because, as you mentioned in the beginning, religion also has, their view on psychedelic interventions. So it's a very, very interdisciplinary field, and I think that is also what makes it so very interesting. And I think the collaboration across fields is 100% necessary. Just running a trial like this, you will at least need a medical doctor and a psychologist, right? And usually you need many more people like the ones I just listed. So it definitely is. It definitely is very, very interdisciplinary. And my impression is that at least with psychedelic research, we're not really working in silos. We're also, of course, looking at the studies that are going on in the preclinical phase, so with animals. So of course, there you have again, pharmacologists, you have biologists, etc., etc. So it is inherently interdisciplinary, and I think this is really, really important and good because otherwise you could not run a single study.
From your experience, what are some of the misconceptions or myths about psychedelic substances, and how do you address them in your work?
Yeah. So I think there are two major misconceptions, and the first one is something that we already discussed: is these drugs are not addictive, and that is something that we need to explain to participants, that there are differences between drugs, between illegal drugs, and one major difference here is that psychedelics are not addictive. There's another major misconception, and that is that psychedelics are going to heal the world, and you take a psychedelic and then your life is completely changed and you're free of any psychiatric illness. You're free of, other, it's debated for other illnesses as well. So psychedelics will not be the magic bullet. We have already touched upon this. There are some people who respond really, really well. There are other people who don't. And that, unfortunately, is a fact. And that is something that we also need to discuss with patients, that, no intervention comes without any risk. And there is just no guarantee that people will get better. And also, and kind of related to that, there are very few cases, where you just, you take the psychedelic and, everything is peachy after that. It's a therapeutic process, which requires, as I said, preparation. It requires, the administration, but it also requires a lot of work after the administration. So we're talking about, weeks of therapy after that. So it's not like that, you take the psychedelic and then, it does the work for you. It's still work that the patient has to do, and it can be exhausting. But yeah, the psychedelic is supposed to facilitate the therapy, but it's not the therapy itself. The patient really has to do some work, and I think that is important for people to know, whether they have loved ones who are undergoing the therapy, or whether it's the patient themselves, that a lot of work is really done after the administration.
You're talking about like, things to be cautious of. What, as someone who might be considering using psychedelics, or thinking that like this could be like even though it isn't the magic bullet, what should they consider? What should they take into account before, like, they jump right in and say, this might just help me. I don't know, nothing has worked.
Yeah. So first of all, you need to, I mean, in most countries, psychedelics continue to be illegal. Even if they are legal, you need to find, a professional center that makes sure that you are safe, right? So that is, and with medical professionals. So that is key, right? There may be some, retreats or others around which may not be professional, which may be illegal, who don't have the qualified personnel on site to keep you safe. And I can only recommend staying away from that.
And
Yeah,
sorry to interrupt you, but what about cases of psychotic breaks, which have
yeah.
been known to happen? There's not much conversation about it because we are in that phase of let's promote this until it's legalized. And that's kind of like brushed under the carpets, like don't ignore this, this crazy cousin that I have kind of situation. So I want you to go a little bit deeper onto that, and what are the pitfalls? What are the possible pitfalls?
Yeah. So as I said, we exclude people from these studies who either have any psychotic symptoms in the past, or even with their first degree relatives. We have not seen any psychotic breaks in patients and or healthy participants who don't have a predisposition. But as I mentioned in the beginning, and that relates back to, well, you need a professional environment. That is, because we have this professional environment. We know exactly the dose that we administer. We make sure it's not too high, and we can help people during the trip as well as after. And I think that is key. So if you have ever experienced psychotic symptoms in the past, or even if it is in your somewhere in your family, it's probably not a good idea. The same holds true with cardiac diseases. If you have any cardiac or cardiovascular problems, psychedelics increase the blood pressure. So if that is an issue, you just need to stay away from these substances. And of course, then the next question is, well, why do you want to take them? And are you mentally prepared, and are you in a state where you can actually, have this experience, where you can surrender to this experience? If you've been in a car crash yesterday, probably not a good idea.
Mhm.
If your partner broke up with you yesterday, also probably not a good idea. Like, there needs to be a level of stability, even in a professional environment, that allows you to actually, have a good or helpful experience. And if you are super stressed, if if there is something happening right now, it's not the right time to undergo such an experience, even if you're otherwise super healthy.
And where can people follow your work, see what you're working on? Are you on social media? Do you have a website?
Yeah, so the University of Zurich has a website. I'm also on X, formerly Twitter. Yeah, please feel to follow me there and reach out.
I'll add the links to your like platforms on the show notes. And thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. That was a pleasure.